Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. I'm so happy that you have joined us here for this event. My name is Ellie. I'm a co-founder of Animal Alliance Asia, and I will be facilitating this panel today. So today we really want the audience to also share their experience and thoughts during the discussion as well, because we want to also learn from advocates and activists across Asia beyond the countries that we are representing today. So please use the chat function for that purpose and share your own experiences as well. We'll also take some questions at the end, so please type away your questions in the chat anytime during the talk, and we'll try our best to go through as many of them as possible at the end. And in order to keep this a safe space, please stick to our code of conduct when you use the chat function. The link to our code of conduct will be pasted by our tech team. Thank you, Charles. But in a nutshell, please be compassionate to each other in the chat, and this is not a place for a fight. And hand signals. So we're all online today, so let's use this hand signal to show agreement or excitement for what's being said or shared, so that we can all see each other's reactions and enjoy the community spirit. And views expressed by the panel today are of their own and not necessarily those of Animal Alliance Asia as an organization. Right. So I will say a few things about what we're talking about today and move swiftly to introduce our panel. So we had Animal Advocacy Conference Asia 2020 last year in November, and through the workshops, networking hours, discussions, and personal conversations, we have been gaining insights into what culturally specific challenges are faced by Asian communities and some potential solutions. Given the size of the human and non-human animal population in Asia, activists and organizations in Asia have both the potential and responsibility to become leaders in the global animal justice movement. But we have heard concerns about activists in Asia feeling like their voices are not represented enough in the vegan or animal justice movement. And as a lot of you have probably experienced it firsthand, it's vital that we are mindful of the differences in cultural context and the complexity of the diverse communities in Asia, and how approaches that have worked in the West don't necessarily always work as well in Asia. So how can we create a more inclusive movement in Asia, and how can we achieve a truly diverse movement to create resilience? To discuss that, today we have a wonderful panel. Activists from Pakistan, Hong Kong, India, Japan, and Myanmar. Right, so let me introduce the panel. We have Alia. Hi, Alia, graduated in architecture from NCA Lahore, Pakistan. She worked with grassroots organizations in Pakistan for sexual minorities, art education, human rights, and non-human rights, providing shelter to non-humans and creating awareness for non-humans for 5 years as an activist. Moving on to Angel. Hi, Angel. Co-director of Animal Alliance Asia, based in Hong Kong, Angel is committed to helping increase the effectiveness of vegan advocates, particularly in Asia. She has been creating educational content on social media in Chinese and English for 3 years. Moving on to Asta. Hi, Asta. Asta is a law student in India, and she's passionate about constitutional law, human rights law, and environmental justice. She works with organizations on animal protection. She has interned with India's Ministry of Law and assisted with guidelines on conservation of wildlife. She has published her research on issues relating to climate change in several undergraduate law journals. Moving on to Kaho. Hi, Kaho. Born and raised in Japan, moved to Canada to study sociology. She's passionate about social justice, particularly the issues of animal exploitation and environmental racism. She hopes to build solidarity across social movements by engaging conversations with other movements, as well as activists from various cultural and social backgrounds. And last but not least, Mimi. Hi, Mimi. She's an English degree student in Bangkok, originally from Myanmar. She's an intersectional humanitarian and she's especially passionate about animal welfare and building a kinder, non-speciesist world. So that's the panel for today. And let me just go into the themes that we're talking today. So there were a few common themes and factors that seem to play a big part in our animal justice advocacy in Asia. And today we'll be focusing on a few of them. So to set the scene, Alia, would you like to share your thoughts and insights on why it's important to focus on culturally specific challenges in advocacy?
Exactly, Ellie, thank you. When we speak of animal advocacy in the context of region-specific issues, it is vital to understand the level of resistance to accepting veganism varies from region to region within geographical locations itself. Developing countries like Pakistan have varying cultures within regions. And just to give you a slight idea, there are about 74 different languages that are indigenous to the region, some that are completely different in understanding. Regions like such are layered with a number of factors like indigenous culture, religion, language, post-colonial culture, systems like feudalism, and even newly Western-inspired consumer cultures that are coming in from the West. If you look at these layer by layer, we might be able to decode this idea better. Firstly and foremostly, it is vital to unpack these layers while understanding that these are highly complex systems in itself and they're intertwined. Secondly, we can identify the loopholes that can give us more leverage for penetration into the system and sowing seeds for the movement on ground for future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. So as she has already mentioned, the elements that we're going to focus on today are religion, language, and socio-political context in Asia. So let's dive right into religion first. So religion was definitely brought up a lot and seems to be a common denominator. It seems to play a huge role in shaping the animal justice advocacy in Asia. So let's hear from our panelists. And also please remember to also share your thoughts and experience as well. I would like to encourage all the audience to do that in the chat as well. So Charles, if you could spotlight everyone again, I could do that as well. Okay, so let's start from Angel. Angel, would you like to share your experience and thoughts on religious factors in Hong Kong and Taiwan? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Ellie and Alia for the introduction. So I have been living in Hong Kong for a number of years and I can talk about the situation here. I have not lived for a long time in mainland China or Taiwan, but I've had some conversations with people who are based in there. And I believe that the situation is quite similar. So an observation that we have is that people might think that veganism is tied to Buddhism. And I will add that there are many sects within Buddhism and varied practices. So I will speak about the practices that I'm more aware of that I observe here in Hong Kong. From my understanding of Buddhism, like there's this Buddhist belief that one shall not kill. However, vegetarianism or veganism is not compulsory for Buddhists, and monastics are actually allowed to eat what is called threefold pure meat. So what it means is that it's meat that is from animals who are not seen, heard, or suspected killed for oneself. So for example, Buddhists, monks or nuns, they can accept alms or offerings, food from other people, and they are expected to accept it with gratitude even. And in today's world, unfortunately, a lot of these offerings contain or are animal products. So how this affects animal advocacy here is that some people might get confused about the relationship between Buddhism and veganism or a vegan diet. And it might bar some people from trying or even being receptive to learning about the philosophy of veganism when they have this mindset this preconceived notion that veganism or a veg diet is only for Buddhists, and when they don't identify with that label. So I'll stop here and let other panelists talk about how religion affects veganism in their countries.
Thank you so much, Angel, for sharing that. So I'd like to move on to Myanmar. So Mimi, you have told us before that Buddhism is also a big factor in Myanmar as well. Would you like to share your thoughts on that, please?
Thank you, Ali. So yes, in Myanmar especially, we are a particularly religious country, primarily Buddhism. And how this influences animal advocacy or animal welfare in general is that we have a common general belief where any human being that did bad things in their past life, for example, they would gather up bad karma, bad dharma, for example, and in their next life, as a result of that, their consequence will be to be reborn as someone who will be of disadvantage, someone who will be born into poverty, or they will be born as animals. So because of that belief, animals are considered an inferior being. And that results in the way where animal rights is not commonly practiced here. There's a lot of speciesism that comes up. So this is primarily one of the key influences of how religion impacts the lack of animal welfare and consideration of animal sanctions in our country. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Mimi. That is very interesting. Let's move on to Japan. So, Kaho, is there any religious factors that are affecting advocacy in Japan?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. So although most Japanese people don't identify themselves as religious, the Japanese culture itself is very much influenced by the religion of Shintoism as well as Buddhism. But I'm only going to speak to Shintoism as it's specific to Japanese culture. And so Japanese culture is also, it's influenced by the religion of Shintoism, but more specifically the aspects of animism. And animism and Shintoism basically believes that any living and non-living entities have spirits. And although animism essentially respects all life forms by seeing everything has spirit, now this kind of concept is used in a very convenient human-centric way. So for instance, when we make an argument for like eating animals because they feel pain and they're different from plants, people often use like, but plants have life too. And I think it's slightly different from like what we hear things like, what about plants though in a Western culture context? Because people in Japan often kind of like put like human characteristics into like plants along with other non-human animals and other natural entities like rocks and mountains. However, people who say that kind of thing often don't even know where these like animals or the vegetables even come from, or how they produce. So I'm not saying that this kind of animistic worldview is bad, but I think that this worldview is conveniently appropriated to justify the consumption of meat.
Thank you so much for that, Kaho. Let's move on to Pakistan. So obviously there must be factors from Islam in terms of religion there. So would you like to talk about that, please, Alia? Thank you.
Definitely. Ellie, there are two major factors that become a hindrance. One is the idea of the superior being, the human being the superior to all other life forms, known as Ashraful Makhlukat. And the other is the yearly sacrificial ceremony. Both of these concepts that actually make it a vital part of being a Muslim in Pakistan.
There seems to be a connection issue, Alia. Would you be able to turn off your camera maybe? So it might be a better connection that way.
Yeah, hello. Sorry. So basically, there are two major factors that are affecting advocacy and its movement. One is the idea of superior being, and the other is the animal sacrifice. Now, a third layer, which is the blasphemy law charges. Now, if you don't agree with all the religious factors, you can actually be accused of blasphemy because the blasphemy law in itself is not defined. So it becomes very tricky for activists to use religion as, to actually challenge any religious debate and talk about the importance of animal life, and so that it becomes a bit of a friction over there. So what I have noticed in my little experience is that rather than challenging or engaging in any debates directly about religion, we can always bypass that and speak in terms of allyship with liberal scholars, maybe who can actually voice it better, and maybe use the idea of Islam that covers compassion for animals and educate people towards that, rather than challenging existing subject matters in the religious area. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the insights, Alia. So we can now move on to the next huge element, which is the language. This seems to be another unique and interesting aspect that affects our advocacy across Asia a lot. So again, I would like to encourage our audience to share your experience as well, how language has affected your advocacy in Asia. Please share your thoughts away in the chat. So let's start from Pakistan. Alia, would you like to talk about how language is affecting advocacy in Pakistan?
Yes, Ellie. In Pakistan, there is no term for veganism, right? So that in itself, the term vegan is it's looked at as a very Western word, and it's usually associated with people who come with a higher income bracket, who can afford a certain lifestyle. So it's an elite lifestyle rather than a movement in itself. And if we look at any local terms, they actually come from Sanskrit, which bases its roots in Hinduism, which is Shakahari. So then again, Shakahari, the term itself is more about the plant eater. It's limited to a plate. It's to an eating habit. It's not actually connected to a bigger movement in itself. So there are local words like janwar, which means a living thing. But then how can we associate that with the present, with the movement itself, so that people can relate to the movement as for animals rather than just a lifestyle in itself? So I really think that there needs to be a lot of research done in terms of local language, regional language, and maybe specific terms for specific areas that the masses can actually start relating to, and through which we can educate them. Because if there is no language or mode of communication with people, how can we convince them to move towards a movement itself? That's from me. Thank you.
That's such an important element. Thank you, Alia. Asta, there must be loads of different languages in India. Would you like to share your thoughts on how that affects your advocacy in India, please?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. Like Elia mentioned, the word for vegetarianism is Shakahari in India, in Hindi, and the word for non-vegetarian is Mansahari. So, an omnivore and a person who eats meat is considered as a Mansahari, whereas a person who eats vegetarian food is considered a Shakahari. Now, vegetarian food also includes dairy products, and it is a very important part of Indian diet. But there is a long way to go in India because there is, like Elia also mentioned, there is no word for veganism in India. and veganism is restricted amongst the elites in India. And a lot of vegetarian people are also very skeptic about switching to veganism because they think that there is very little option available for people who are vegan. And you have restricted choice of food, and you have a restricted lifestyle, and people think that going vegan is for the people who are very health conscious, and it's not something that is there for the masses. And I think a lot of people are unaware of the fact that veganism is also important from animal rights point of view, and it is also important from animal rights perspective. So like Elia mentioned, even in India, we have a long way to go. And I think the only way we can uh, create awareness about animal rights and veganism is by educating the masses. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Asta. So the term veganism, which is an English term that was coined in England in the 40s, this seems to be a bit of an issue from what you said, both of you, Alia and Asta, because it's an English term and there's no direct translation in local languages that captures the concept of veganism. So it's seen as a Western lifestyle or diet even. Is there something similar in Japan? Are there any other language aspects that are affecting our advocacy? Kaho?
Thank you, Ellie. So the concept of veganism is still new in Japan as well, and when it does get mentioned, it's literally translated into a plant-based diet. So when the mainstream media like mentions the word vegan, it really covers anything about animals. It only talks about the health and environmental aspects of it. And so it's common to see like the same section in a TV show that talks about veganism or the plant-based diet, and just right after that they talk about like zoos or aquariums and stuff like that. Another aspect of language that seems really unique in Japan that affects our animal advocacy is the use of like a political language. So when we had like a climate strike, they had to change the name to climate march because the word strike is too political and they can't bring kind of opposition from the public. So they had to change it to a march instead of a strike. And in animal advocacy, people often avoid kind of overly like aboriginal approach and say, let's reduce the consumption of meat instead of saying, let's stop eating animals, and which we don't really see in the West. But it might be kind of suited in the Japanese context because if you are too overly political, then you might kind of push off the people who might be interested in joining the movement. But this kind of message can be also misleading as well. So we have to create more engaging environment where people can talk about it instead of just like, expressing the message, like let's reduce meat consumption or let's stop eating animals. Not just the message, but just discuss why it's important to reduce meat consumption or stop eating animals. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Kaho. So let's move on to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China. We've had one speaker from China at Animal Advocacy Conference Asia 2020, and Jian Yi from Good Food Fund China has shared an interesting campaign that had happened in China about the language use in advocacy. So would you like to share your thoughts about Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China? Angel, please. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Ellie. So I think in terms of language, I would say there are two parts to this issue for Chinese. So the first is the word for vegetarian or vegan in Chinese might lead to people thinking it's like a sacrifice you have to make. You have to give up something. You are lacking something. You are being deprived of something. So in order to help shift this perspective, some groups and, for example, the Good Food Fund try to use more positive words. For example, plant forward to describe a plant-based lifestyle or diet. And that is the first issue. And the second is, again, we lack a word for veganism, a word that encompasses the whole idea. So what we're using in Chinese now, and I believe this is actually, it sounds similar to what Anami has mentioned in the chat box. So in Vietnam, I think it's J, if I remember correctly from our speaker from that conference last year. And in Mandarin Chinese is Chai, in Cantonese, Zai, all sounds very similar. And it, if we want to refer to veganism, we literally just call it pure vegetarianism or like complete vegetarianism. So there's no consensus as to how to describe veganism as a philosophy. And there are many different terms in Chinese for different kinds of plant-based diets. You have the Buddhist vegetarian diet, which forbids 5 particular types of pungent plants because they might, they're not in line with some Buddhist beliefs. And you have terms like vegetarian, vegan, and also vegans who also don't eat those 5 types of plants, but who aren't necessarily Buddhist. So it's a little bit messy. So what we know of as a potential solution to this is we see, again, the Good Food Fund, they organized an open call last year, 2019, and they engaged the public. They wanted the public to suggest Chinese characters that would represent a plant-forward or vegan dietary choice. And it sounded very successful. Over 10,000 people participated, and they chose more than 100 words in the Chinese lexicon, is that the word? What's the Chinese vocabulary? And it started a public discourse, and people also like this competition because it connects people with the Chinese culture instead of, unlike the word vegan, which sounds foreign and sounds like it's imported from the West. So this is one initiative that we can see that is trying to address the language problem in Chinese.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Angel. Leila from the UK, she has shared a very similar experience from Iran. She says in Iran, the word for vegetarian and vegan is the same. So they often use the English word vegan, which feels foreign and Western to the Iranian people, and some Iranians reject it as a Western idea. So that seems to be quite a common aspect that's affecting our advocacy across Asia. Thank you so much for all of your insights. Okay, let's move on to our last big element. So we're going to be talking about socio-political, economic, historical context and across Asia that are affecting the way we advocate for animals. So let's start with India. So Asta, would you like to share your thoughts on the context in India, please?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. So India has a constitution which gives a provision for protection of animals, and it is one of the very few constitutions around the world which have such provision for protection of animals. I think the number is less than 10, if I'm correct. So as you can see, there are very few constitutions around the world which guarantee animals' rights as they guarantee rights to human beings. Before coming to the Constitution of India, I would like to give a brief history of what happened in the colonial and post-colonial era in India. So the first time an anti-cruelty law was introduced in India was by the British rule in the 1980s. But it faced a lot of opposition because bringing an anti-cruelty law would mean that any kind of testing or experiment that used to take place on animals in India would have to be stopped. Then it was in the 1930s that Mahatma Gandhi, in one of his talks, highlighted the importance of moral grounds for opting a vegetarian lifestyle. He himself was a vegetarian, and he gave a talk called Moral Basis of Vegetarianism, in which he highlighted that the reason for going vegetarian is not should not be restricted to health related reasons. It is more than that. For he highlighted the important points from the ancient Hindu text, and he mentioned that there is an ethical reason for going vegetarian, and it it sort of ignited a lot of discussion amongst Indians itself, amongst vegetarian Indians as well. And then, in after the independence, when the Constitution of India was enacted, we have a provision now for protection of animals. Now, coming to the legislations in India that are based on the Constitution. So, there are several laws in India which prevent cruelty against animals, which prevent animal sacrifice, which prevent testing on animals. And I think very recently, the government has also decided to increase the fine which is imposed upon people who inflict cruelty upon animals. But the implementation of these laws is faulty because of the socio-political construct of India. So these are the issues that we have at present in India, and these are some of the ways in which animal advocates are trying to advocate for animals. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Asta. Okay, let's move on to Pakistan. Are there any similar issues that are happening in Pakistan as well, Elia? Would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, I really agree with Asta. There are some laws, but of course, India is very advanced in terms of laws. But then again, implementation of laws in Pakistan is negligible because there is mention of animal abuse. But what sort of abuse? There is no detailed definition of what do we mean by abuse. And there are no systems where that report is to be that abuse is to be reported to or taken action against. So there is a flaw in the law implementation. That because of course it's a developing country and they have their reasons to go by that. But then another predominant, unlike India, predominant reason for non-vegan diet is religion. So religion is affecting our culture as well. And if we look at different regions, as I mentioned earlier, we have nomadic tribes, and we have tribal systems that way on eat. Then we have village systems, towns, and urban systems, and all of these contexts all together. So the strategies need to be different. The awareness level varies for each of it. Like a city like Karachi, there is a lot of cultural difference within regions as well. Then, of course, we have to understand that post-colonial systems are still intact, although we don't have colonizers anymore, but whatever they have left is still affecting us. For example, having 2 eggs for breakfast every morning was never a local, regional diet plan. If we look at our regional diet plan, we would see that you would eat a piece of bread that was left over at night with, maybe some tea or some kava, because tea was also brought in by the colonizers. So like you would have different ways of having a balanced diet rather than having 2 eggs and sausages every morning. So this new trends of post-colonial, Western-inspired diet plans are pretty much very common now. So, and then of course we have religion that bars us controlling further, becoming a barrier in itself. If we look at burgers and steaks and all these other things, we see that this is being imported from the West, because burgers were not common in Pakistan 15 years ago. You would not find a burger joint. So I think there was only one McDonald's in Karachi somewhere. So you see these Western inspired cultures in big cities, and then you have post-colonial cultures in smaller cities, and then you have nomadic and tribal systems in smaller areas. So there are so many layers of history and culture playing around. What I have learned from my previous engagement with smaller groups and grassroots level activists is to find a strategy to decolonize. How do we decolonize food? How do we educate people to understand that food can be decolonized? What we're eating was never ours to begin with. This was not what we used to eat. Maybe it is not important to have 2 eggs for breakfast. You know? So things like that, I believe, might become a possible solution, but it's a very long process of unlayering, unpacking, decoding, deconstructing, decolonizing, in terms of getting to the basic point of and re-educating and regenerating the movement in itself. And I also believe that maybe if we can engage people more on the idea of how healthy local foods are, having a nutritionist on board who can guide us better into that, and so we can educate people in a better way that maybe, no, if you eat something local, it's okay. It's okay not to be cool, or maybe make the local foods cool or hip or in or pop somehow, so that, you know, people can start relating to that. But yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but then there are a lot of differences with India as well, because religion, again, predominantly plays a major role at both sides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia, for sharing such a, interesting insights. Such a wider socio-political and historical context and post-colonialism background is affecting your advocacy in Pakistan. That's been very interesting. Thank you. Let's move on to Myanmar. So Mimi, would you like to share your insights on how your country's socio-political background is affecting your advocacy, please?
Thank you, Ali. So yes, I do find a lot of similarity between what Ashta and what Alia said as well. And I do think that the major influence has to do with our religious background, as I previously mentioned, but also because of our political background as well. Because advocacy in general, it's pretty complicated in my country, because Myanmar currently is more focused on human rights, because people have been deprived of their basic human rights for a long time because of the decades-long oppression that we face, that we are currently facing by the military junta. So right now, we are mainly focusing on rebuilding and developing it economically as a pro-democratically aimed country. So humanitarian movements, it depends. Most of them are not as prioritized unless it's on issues that are directly concerning with the consequences from the oppressive history. But then, even then, they're not as organized because we don't have the necessary resources or education that comes on that will teach us how we can recognize our human rights, how we can implement them. So even then we are currently deprived of that. And alongside the fact that there is a speciesist kind of background, and also the fact that we are a conservative society, animal advocacy, there is a long way to go before we can actually implement it on a community and also on a political level. But one of the good things that I would say is coming out is that we recently just had a law where any purchased animal that are above a certain price or abused or mistreated in any way, you can face legal consequences. But that does not apply to stray animals or animals that are in legal captivity. So there is a way we have to go, but I think it has to start with the human rights movement as well. It is intersectional. And I think one of the ways we can make animal advocacy more effective is if we can teach people that intersectionality in animal rights movement correlates to human rights movement as well. I think that can make it more impactful. So thank you very much, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Let's move on to Japan then. Are there any historical socio-political elements that are affecting your advocacy, Kaho?
Thank you, Ellie. So I'm just gonna talk about the cultural aspect first. So in Japan, we live in a very conformist culture. So doing something different is seen a very outcast. And we have a culture of like shaming of inconveniencing others. And so, for example, like one of the things shared by our participants in AACA was that, so she asked for a menu for if they have like a vegan option, but that felt very awkward, and she had to say sorry, like she had to say, oh, sorry for causing a inconvenience. So that's taken a kind of like a negative way, and it's also kind of mixed with a lack of cultural diversity as well, especially in the rural area, because we don't have many, like, for example, Muslim people who have a dietary restriction, and we're not used to seeing those people who have dietary restrictions. So like asking for something special is seen like very negative. And historical context. So before the large-scale livestock operation that we now have emerged, there was only small-scale family-owned farms. And since the shift to the large-scale farm was very quick, and oftentimes in a really remote area, people often don't know that kind of large-scale farms exist in Japan. So when we do like a street activism, we show like the picture of inside the slaughterhouse or the factory farms in Japan, people often don't like believe that it's in Japan. So there's a lack of kind of awareness to like what's going on in Japan. They kind of think that's like, oh, the problem in Australia or in the States, stuff like that. So there's a need for more understanding and being aware of what's going on in Japan. And there's also the slaughter workers have also been associated with lower class, and discrimination against these communities still exists. And they're seen as kind of like a dirty side of the industry, and vegans or animal activists don't really know about like even the discrimination of it, or just don't know that how they have been historically discriminated against. And that kind of makes them only focus on animal issues, and they don't really talk about any human rights issue that might be a problem to a factory or slaughterhouse workers. And another issue that we have is the idea of cultural authenticity. So Japan is kind of considered a monocultural country, where which is not really true. We have a lot of different cultures, but people really stick to the idea of cultural authenticity. So people think it's of lesser value if traditional meals are made. Traditional meals are not made in a way that they're supposed to. So people often find it difficult to substitute things like fish to something else in a traditional dish. So we need more kind of understanding that culture changes, and we have to be kind of flexible about the fact that, you know, like culture evolves as we evolve, and we have to change our ethical. We have to kind of change our cultural practices according to our ethical awareness as well. So I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaho, for sharing that. In the comments, I see Anami from Germany saying, Kaho, that's very similar in Germany, where people just say it's bad in the US, but it's humane here. So that seems to be quite a universal issue as well. Right, okay. So we're just coming to an end of the panel discussion. We have covered religion, language, and socio-political historical context of each country. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, panelists. The examples and the insights that you have shared today have definitely highlighted how all of these elements are working in synergy or intertwined to create such extremely complex and unique context that makes veganism as a concept or a philosophy seem more inaccessible in Asia. And it's proving to become a challenge against our animal justice advocacy. We definitely need our movement to become more inclusive. And to do that, we need to practice solidarity with fellow activists across Asia, and we need to build more allyships with other movements to deepen our understanding of oppression within specific contexts. And Animal Alliance Asia is in the process of developing trainings and workshops for these purposes. So please do stay tuned for our future announcements as well. So let's move on to a Q&A session. Thank you so much for those who have submitted questions, specifically for you, Asta, from Jennifer from Germany. She asks, we are working on fish welfare in India. Which vocabulary is best used for the local context in your opinion? For example, our India team has suggested talking about natural and organic farming instead of improving welfare. What do you think, Asta?
Hi, Jennifer. I think the suggestion made by your India team is absolutely on point. And often, in order to bypass the different conflicting opinions that exist in our culture, I think organic and natural farming, and these words are, I think, the best suited to bypass the conflicts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Asta. So there's a question for everybody, all the panelists, from Anami from Germany. She asks, she'd love to hear from everybody about your favorite recent wins for the animals in your country, or favorite current campaigns or efforts for animals in your country. Does anyone want to share current campaigns, any wins for the animals in your country? Mimi.
Hi, Anami, thank you for the question. So I think that for my country is what I mentioned earlier regarding a newly established law for animals from a certain price point onwards. I do think that stray animals and animals in captivity, animals in the cosmetics industry, for example, I do believe that it would be great if they can be considered in the law as well. But I think that this is a great start, considering our conservative background. So that would be a great win, I would say. So thank you again for the question.
Thanks, Mimi. Does anyone want to add to that and share any success in your country? Ask that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. So very recently, the Indian government has decided to raise the bar of the fine which used to be imposed for cruelty against animals. And it was only 50,000 Indian rupees, which was a very less amount. They've decided to increase it. And they've also decided to impose a 5-year jail term for inflicting cruelty upon animals. And I think Elia was one of the first few people who shared this news with me. So I think this is a really big positive step for change, because I think the earlier law is kind of old and archaic, and we need new punishments and fines for deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Asta. Kaho, would you like to share anything?
Yes. So there's a new member of the Diet. So it's like a congress in Japan, and who is dedicated to speaking about animal welfare and climate change. And we didn't have that kind of person before. And now that we have him, like, even he doesn't really talk about animal rights, but he is dedicated to talking about animal welfare, which is like a huge step. And I'm excited for seeing any future progress within the Diet. Thank you.
Anyone else who wants to add to this question? Thank you so much, everyone. It's good to hear about positive moves that are happening in different countries. Okay, so moving on to another question from Craig from the UK. He asks, I have a question for the whole group. If your activism is currently on a voluntary basis or in your spare time, do you think you would be more effective in your country as an employed member of an NGO or potentially less effective as part of an NGO? What do you think? Anyone wants to share your thoughts? Would you be more effective as part of a paid employee of an NGO, or would that be less effective as part of an NGO in your country? Angel, go ahead.
I can quickly share my perspective. So right now, and if I can also speak behalf of our panelists, we are all working on a voluntary basis as of this moment. And personally, for me, I think I would love to do this full-time as an employee of a group. So because I really want to devote my time and energy on the cause. So I think hopefully it also means that I will be effective in my work. So yeah, we are working towards growing our organization so that we can have a sustainable group, people working sustainably for the cause.
Thank you, Angel. Does anyone else want to share your thoughts? Okay. Oh, Alia, yes, please.
I think it's a very subjective question because it depends on the strategy of the NGO as well. And definitely if one is getting compensated, it does help. But I think the strategy of any movement matters more than being paid or not paid. Like a lot of wins in the histories have been made by volunteers. So it's not necessary, but yeah, it depends on the strategy of what is to be achieved in the end. Thank you. That's my answer.
Thank you so much, Alia. Right, okay. Anyone else wants to add? No, okay. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, so from George from the UK and Japan, he asks, in your respective countries, is there a possibility of working with climate justice activists to argue consumption of products from animal must be reduced? Anyone wants to answer this question about your country? Kaho, go ahead.
Yeah, in Japan, people actually started using like message card, like let's reduce animal consumption in their activism in climate activism. So that's, I could definitely see that kind of connection already happening there. But at the same time, they only talk about the consumption of meat, like the eating of meat, and they don't really talk about other things like animal testing or zoos, aquariums, and stuff like that. So that is the problem I would see, but that's definitely a step towards working together and build coalition across movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaho. Anyone else who wants to add to this question about climate justice movement? Yes, Angel, thank you.
Thanks. I think it's kind of similar in Hong Kong. Pre-COVID era, we started having more climate strikers and climate activists, especially youths, which is very encouraging in Hong Kong. And some of them do have made the connection between climate change and the consumption of animal products. And similar to Japan, it's usually a reducitarian or incremental ask. So I think it's definitely a good sign to see the two movements trying to work together towards a shared goal. And I am excited to see how we can potentially work together to make more progress. And especially for Hong Kong, there is a group called Green Monday, and they have made a vegan lifestyle much more accessible for the general public in the past couple of years, and they're actually expanding to a couple of Asian countries, including China. So I am very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angel. Some people have also commented that in their countries, they do integrate the story of climate justice and animal justice together in the narrative. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, moving on to another question. Right, another question from Craig, specifically for Mimi. So Mimi, are there any NGOs focusing on farm animals or diet change in Myanmar, and therefore on the intersections that you have mentioned? Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you, Craig, for the question. So regarding your answer, there's none, at least as far as the effectiveness goes. Right now, the only kind of animal welfare organizations there are small-scale shelters for dogs and cats. Those are the most common ones. But even then, those are usually local and self-funded by individuals, such as anyone here that rescued animals will know how hard it is. So those would be the only kind of animal warfare organizations or groups there are. And for farm animals, there is none, but there are international organizations that are trying to incorporate Myanmar into their program regarding, for example, welfare for chickens, regarding battery cages, and similar programs like that. But as we are still as I mentioned earlier, as we are still a conservative country, we are not that proactive when it comes to such movements. Even if the organizations want to be involved, we are not really proactive in welcoming them as much yet. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that, Craig, for the question.
Thank you so much, Mimi. I have another question from Kat. This is for all the panelists. Kat asks, has any of your countries had any success with addressing animal rights through food security? So either the public or private sector in your countries, have they looked at how to transition from animal farming to plant-based farming, or ending government subsidies for animal farming? There has been done a small scale success in the US and Europe. Have you seen any talk of this in your countries? Does anyone want to share? Even if it's a no, do you want to talk about it? Yes, Alia, thank you.
Yeah, we just recently, I read a very opposite article that our government is actually putting in billions of rupees into meat subsidies. It's quite the opposite to what is being expected, because everything is becoming expensive, and there's a lot of inflation, and food prices are getting like higher and higher. So they're, instead of funding the farmers, they're putting in subsidies for meat. Yeah.
Thank you, Alia, for talking about that. Anyone else wants to add to this question about transition to plant-based farming in your country? Okay, all right, let's move on. Okay, so this is actually a question for everybody, I think. So IE wants to know all the panelists' social media accounts. So if you all don't mind sharing it in the chat, please go ahead and do that so everyone can follow you as well. If you don't want to, you don't need to. Thank you. Okay, and right, shall I add this maybe? Okay, so about the question that Craig asked previously about working with either with NGO or individually, he wanted to add something. So what he meant by that question is that in some countries, Craig has heard that the government may regard NGOs are disruptive, and therefore more effect could be gained instead by forming an NPO which promotes diet change or something. Would that apply to any of your countries? That the government may regard NGOs as disruptive, and that could lead to less effective advocacy? Does that apply to any of you? No. Okay, no, thank you for sharing that, Craig. Since we have a bit of time, someone, Anami from Germany, asked she'd love to hear how each panelist got into animal protection activism, if we have the time. So yeah, we have a few minutes for each. If you want to share your story, how you got into this activism. Anyone wants to share your story from the panelists? I'm sure it would be very inspiring. Yes, Mimi, go ahead. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the question. So for me personally, I actually grew up surrounded by a lot of animals actually. I had cats and dogs and birds and fishes and a lot of animal friends throughout my childhood. And I just observed the way that people didn't really seem to, I think one of the breaking points is that one time a visitor accidentally hit my dog and they yelled and my relatives started laughing. So I was confused because clearly the animal was in pain. But I told them that as a child, I was very outspoken. So I told them that, why are you laughing? The puppy is hurt. Apologize because I was a kid. So, and they just basically didn't respond well. So I think that was one of the breaking points. And from then on, I just started to learn more about animal advocacy, animal welfare in other countries, speciesism. And I think I started to transition into a vegan lifestyle when I watched Gary Yourofsky's The Greatest Speech You Ever Heard. So from there, I also, it was from there I become more inspired to not just be, I thought that if I'm an animal lover and I'm continuing to eat meat, dairy, eggs, etc., what Gary is trying to tell me is that I'm not really an animal lover and I need to do more because I think we're living in the kind of community, especially for mine, where animal lives are not really considered important and people would take advantage of them a lot. So I thought that I need to do something for the animals in any way that I can, even if I am, I feel like I am standing alone in this conservative society. There is something I can do. And so I try to be more proactive. And that's how I got here and be a part of this team. And I'm really grateful to be speaking with you all. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that, Mimi. Before we move on to another person, we've got some really good comments that I wanted to share with everyone. So George from the UK, Japan says, never seen such an informative panel on cross-cultural comparisons in animal justice advocacy across Asia before. Such interesting insights, amazing event. Thank you, George, for sharing that. Okay, and I think we might have missed one question. Let me just go back to it. Okay, so Gina from Taiwan, I think, she asks, one thing that I have observed in the plant-based alternative protein industry talks in Asia is a focus on developing culturally and taste-relevant meat alternative. Does this help the animal advocacy cause and changing local understandings on veganism? Does anyone want to talk about what's happening in your country? Yes, Angel, thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. Thank you, Gina, for your question. I think these more culturally taste relevant alternatives help the cause. So as an example, the organization that I just mentioned, Green Monday, they also developed their own product called Omni Pork, which is a pork replacement. And the reason why, and this is their first product, the reason being pork is a very common choice of meat in, at least in Cantonese societies and probably in a lot of Chinese households as well. So that's what they aimed for when they tried to find to create an alternative, something that a lot of people use in their in a conventional diet. And I think these alternatives really help the cause because they make the behavioral change more easier for people. Making the environment more conducive to behavioral change is definitely really important.
Thank you, Angel. Does anyone else want to share about the protein alternative in your country? How that's moving forward? Okay, thank you so much. We've got really nice comments again from Prina from the UK. It's been wonderful, found it really insightful. Thank you very much. Leila from the UK, thank you for an amazing panel, very helpful, thank you. Hassan says, thank you for the amazing and insightful discussion. Peter says, love hearing how all the panelists have made the connection. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, I see one new question from Ai. Have you ever heard the term white veganism, or is there a particular term or way you describe predominantly white Western veganism? Does anyone want to share your thoughts on that? I think we have touched upon this quite a bit about how the term vegan or veganism comes from the West and how that is affecting the resistance in each country already. But does anyone want to add to this? Kaho, did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like the term veganism itself is really foreign and Western to us. And I think when we think of the word veganism, we tend to think about kind of white middle class, like, you know, women cooking in the kitchen or something like that. So that's the kind of image that we tend to associate with. So I don't think we have any particular term that describe the white veganism that we often discuss in the Western context. And I think it's really different in the Asian countries too, because some countries are like formally colonized by the Western country and others are not. So we can't, sometimes it's more relevant to that culture or the country, but not to others. But it's definitely a good discussion to have across Asia as well. But one thing that I think we should be focusing on is kind of like a cultural imperialist aspects of it. Not just the term, the white veganism, but how the Western vegan movement or animal advocacy movements kind of pressuring to assimilate trying to assimilate us into their kind of forms of activism, which necessarily don't work in Asia. So if you haven't watched the video by Ahmad from Palestinian Animal League, he did the speech, he did the talk in ASE, and it's on YouTube, and he talks about white saviorism as well, and that's really insightful, and I think help us understand what's going on in that kind of cultural context. So yeah, I think if anyone hasn't watched it, it's on YouTube on our page. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kaho. Angel, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your question, Ai. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think, and I have heard of the term and come across the term white veganism on social media, and it seems to me it refers to veganism or the advocacy of veganism that comes from a very privileged place that doesn't take into consideration people's other struggles or the other layers of oppression that we have talked about. I hope this is what you're referring to as white veganism. And I have heard of the term, and I don't think it's been widely discussed in Hong Kong, at least within my community. If I can just share some examples. Last year, after the murder of George Floyd, and I'm speaking for myself, there are some of my activist friends with good intentions. They started using, like, saying animals' lives matter too, things like that. And then this year, there had been, just recently, there has been some discussion about whether we should compare the suffering of human animals and non-human animals. However, I do not see that discussion occurring in Hong Kong either. And I think that maybe the movement is just a little bit behind in Hong Kong, or like we are still catching up. A lot of activists here, even though we have good intentions, it just takes time for us to be informed about all these interconnected and all these layers of oppression. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Angel, for sharing that. I'm just gonna move on to the ending of this panel. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Please follow us on social media for the future events. And you can also catch the recording of this talk on our YouTube channel. And you can also join our mailing list to be updated on our future events. Charles, would you mind sharing our social media addresses, please? Thank you, in the chat. And I'm really hoping that we can continue the conversation beyond this event on these challenges. And we hope that together in solidarity, we can make the movement more inclusive and resilient for a bigger impact. We are also looking for people to work with in countries across Asia, whether individual activists volunteering with us or local organizations who may be able to collaborate with us. We definitely want to hear from you. So please do email us at info@aaconference-asia.com. That's been shared in the chat right now. Thank you, Charles. We look forward to hearing from you for potential collaboration. And last but not least, we are a small nonprofit organization run by volunteers only so far. So please do consider supporting us by donating. You can enable us to do more educational events like this in the future. You can support us from the link that's been shared in the chat right now. Thank you so much for your consideration. And thank you everyone in the panel for sharing all the insights today. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today. Have a good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and see you all very soon. Thank you.